Good evening. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater at the National Archives, and a special welcome to those who are joining us on our YouTube channel. We're very pleased tonight to host Joseph Ellis to launch the publication of his new book, The Quartet, Orchestrating the Second American Revolution. We're all familiar with the First American Revolution, which broke the bonds between the 13 colonies in Great Britain. But once independence was won, how would the new nation survive? The Quartet tells the story of those who shaped the government that we still have today. Tonight's conversation with Professor Ellis is but one of the many programs we regularly present here in this theater, and I hope you'll consider coming back tomorrow for our afternoon or evening programs, or both. At noon tomorrow, Pulitzer Prize-winning author and journalist David K. Shipler will discuss his book, Freedom of Speech, Mightier Than the Sword, and a book signing will follow the program. In the evening at 6 p.m., we'll host a forum that will dissect the results of the recent National Civics Poll conducted by the Purdue Institute for Civic Communication, and the answers may surprise and scare you. To learn more about these and all of our public programs and exhibits, consult our monthly calendar of events in print or online, and there are copies in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets. Another way you can get more involved in the National Archives is to become a member of the Foundation for the National Archives, and the Foundation supports all of our education and outreach work, and there are applications also in the lobby. In school, our American history lessons usually skipped from the Battle of Yorktown to the Constitutional Convention and the beginning of the new nation under the federal Constitution. The Articles of Confederation would merit a quick reference, inevitably described as weak and ineffective, but the pre-federal era was generally treated as a time left best unmarked. But time did not stand still for the new United States between 1783 and 1789. These 6 years were crucial to the creation of a single nation out of 13 states. And the quartet of Joseph Ellis's title, George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, were instrumental in making that happen. As reviewer Matthew Simpson writes, Ellis shows the extraordinary capacity of these four leaders to understand the events, discuss them dispassionately, explain them to the American people, reach compromise, rise above pettiness and sacrifice, personal wealth, power, and popularity for the long-term public good. Given the rarity of these qualities today, Ellis's book is a compelling reminder of the political virtues that created the American Republic. A great way to learn more about the quartet is to read their original records through Founders Online, our website, founders.archives.gov, made possible through our National Historical Publications and Records Commission. Joseph Ellis is one of the nation's leading scholars of American history. The author of 8 books, Ellis received the Pulitzer Prize for Founding Brothers, The Revolutionary Generation, and won the National Book Award for American Sphinx, a biography of Thomas Jefferson. His in-depth chronicle of the life of our first president, His Excellency George Washington, was a New York Times bestseller. Ellis's last book, Revolutionary Summer, The Birth of American Independence, was a national bestseller also. His essays and book reviews appear regularly in national publications, and his commentaries have been featured on CBS, C-SPAN, CNN, and the PBS NewsHour. He's appeared in several documentaries on early America, including John and Abigail Adams for PBS's The American Experience, and a History Channel documentary on George Washington. Ellis currently teaches at the Commonwealth Honors College at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. He previously taught at Mount Holyoke College and at the United States Military Academy at West Point. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Joseph Ellis.
Sounds like an impressive guy, you know? Thank you for that. Oh, wow, good audience. Thank you for that overly gracious introduction. It's a good place for me to start talking about this book that I've written, because we're in the facility that houses the two seminal documents of American history, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. I asked the powers that be whether it's really true that these documents are in bulletproof glass. If you watch people going by them, they're speaking the words to themselves, much like these were pieces of scripture, and that in the evening they're lowered beneath the surface into a deep cavern or safe where they will be secure even if a nuclear device strikes the city or the District of Columbia and everybody is completely annihilated. The two documents will have survived. Now, I've been told it's not really any longer possible to talk about this because there are new security arrangements in, I'm sure, after 9/11. But something like that used to be the case. These are sacred documents. And one is about how we win independence, and the key document there is the Declaration. And the other is about how we declare nationhood, which is, of course, the Constitution. And there's a kind of dead zone between these two documents. Maybe a black hole is a better word to put it, but somehow, okay, we win the war, we get independence, and then, well, abracadabra, we get to be a nation. That is really wrong. And let me try to begin to probe why it's wrong and move along to say why we need to have a different story to tell if we were going to understand how America became a single people and a nation. I don't know whether the story I'm trying to tell and told in this book is new wine in old bottles or old wine in new bottles, or maybe it's well-chilled Chardonnay in a wonderful glass of its own. I don't know. But partly because the profession of American history is off pursuing other kinds of quarry. They are mostly interested in the inarticulate and the periphery, mainly women, African Americans, and Native Americans. That I'm a bit of a throwback or a relic because I specialize in dead white males. And my major interest is to understand how at the founding the values and institutions that became the American Republic were created, because it's the oldest enduring republic in world history and we're still living under the rules and laws that they made. So, question. This is an honest to heavens question. What's the most famous speech in American history? Second inaugural is a good choice. I'd like it. I think it's the best speech, but it's not the most famous, I would think. It's got to be the Getty. You could say the I Have a Dream speech, I think. That would make, for the younger generation, to some extent, that's maybe more resonant. But the first clause in the first sentence of the most famous speech in American history is historically incorrect. And I found this out because I had to judge a contest, an oratorical contest in Putney, Vermont, in a middle school where my son was teaching, and all 28 boys, all of them extremely dyslexic, had to recite the Gettysburg Address. And halfway through, I realized Lincoln was wrong. Now, there are reasons why he's wrong. What's the first clause? fourscore and 7 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation. No, they didn't. They brought forth a confederation of sovereign states provisionally united to win the war and then go their separate ways, which is precisely what they did. Why does Lincoln want to claim that how much is a score? 20. What's 4 times 20? Plus 7? 1863 minus 87 is 1776. The latter part of the sentence will make it absolutely clear. 70 years our fathers brought forth this country, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Jefferson's words. So that's got to be 1776. Lincoln says we were a nation in 1776. Why in 1863 does Lincoln have to make that argument in order to justify the Civil War? He has to be able to argue the Union preceded the existence of the states. If he doesn't argue that, the Confederacy's argument that they can secede from the Union because they pre-exist the Union is more constitutionally correct. And guess what? It was. So we can forgive him this blunder for reasons that are, bending history here served a larger purpose, to rally support behind the Union at a time when all those dead were mounting up to what became 632,000. Okay. If you think about it, there's no way we could have become a nation in 1776 and didn't wish to be a nation. The resolution for independence, voted on July 2nd, 1776, put forward by the Virginia delegation, written by Richard Henry Lee, reads as follows. These colonies are and have every right to be independent states. The colonies revolted as states, not as a nation. And if you think back, what were the arguments between 1765 and 1775 that the colonists were making against Great Britain? You can't tax us, and you cannot, now by 1772, you can't legislate at all for us. That right belongs to the state legislatures. If you think about it in another way, this is almost a psychological way. The typical American in 1770s, 80s is born, lives out his or her life, and dies within a 30-mile radius. And I know this is big. They don't have cell phones. Distance makes a real difference. And people simply did not acknowledge the legitimacy of any source of political authority far removed from them geographically. And so the argument was, Parliament can't possibly represent us because they're way over there. By the way, we don't have any representatives in Parliament either. As a result, when they come to founding a government, it's not really a government. The Articles of Confederation were passed in 1777. It took 4 years to get ratified because there was this little thing called the War of Independence going on, and it was difficult to make this happen. So passed in 77, ratified in 1781. The Articles of Confederation locate sovereignty in the individual states. There are very few powers given to the central government, postal office, currency, but each state can print its own currency too. The last thing they want is to create a central government that has power over them, because that's what they think they're getting away from. The only thing the Americans have in common before the Revolution is membership in the British Empire. The thing they have in common during the war is the cause, the common commitment to independence, which about 19% of the population loyalists don't go along with. Once the war ends, what is there to hold them together? Nothing. And they start to drift. Let me give you an example. I don't want to go too long because I want to stay within 40 minutes and have some questions. Cornwallis gets himself onto the peninsula, the Tidewater Peninsula, and it's like a perfect storm, benevolent perfect storm for us. The French fleet happens to come up from the Caribbean just at that moment. They got him pinned, but then Washington and Rochambeau, the French general, have to get down from New York to Virginia, right? And trap him. And they know this is going to happen, and it's going to be the culminating battle in the war. Yorktown. They don't have any money to get the troops down. Nobody in the States has paid their levy for the Army. It's voluntary. Robert Morris, Superintendent of Finance, sits down and writes a check, a personal check for $683,000. And they go. It happens at the end of the war. It happens when the Peace of Paris or Treaty of Paris is paid. The troops haven't been paid for 2 years. They don't have uniforms. The Southern Army under Greene is wearing loincloths. And the pensions they've been promised are not going to happen. The Continental Army is the embodiment of a national army. That's for it's hated. They leave without pensions. They're beggars when they go home. It's a disgrace. Morris says, this is a disgrace. I'm going to write another check for $572,000, and everybody's going to get $50. That's how bad it was, though, and those are individual examples of the fact that people's allegiance was not to any central authority, but to their local and state governments. And anything more than that was beyond their ken. Later on in the ratifying convention in Virginia, Patrick Henry says, why would we want to sign this document? Suppose this government is created and the government votes taxes, and the 2 senators from Virginia and the number of representatives all vote against it. Then we're taxed without our consent. The people from Massachusetts, for him, are like a foreign country. They're not fellow Americans. A national ethos does not exist. Where is history headed in the 1780s? Centrifugal forces are strengthening, centripetal forces are declining. We're a banana republic. We have a $40 million debt, no way to pay it off, and all the markets in Europe, most especially the Dutch bankers, realize that we have no credit. Every state has its own foreign policy. Massachusetts is negotiating maritime agreements with London on its own. New York is charging tariffs against Delaware, New Jersey, and Connecticut and Rhode Island. New York likes it this way. This is one of the reasons New York's going to vote against the Constitution. There's in the Treaty of Paris, it says you cannot confiscate the estates and do physical harm to loyalists who did not bear arms against the rebellion. They sat it out or they went away. They're confiscating all their estates in New York. It's a huge stream of revenue for them. Okay. What's happening, I would call the Europeanization of North America. America is headed in a particular direction. The government under the Articles isn't a government, it's a League of Nations. Each state is a nation. And there's no commitment to a central force because there's no commitment to American existence as a national existence. The best we can hope for is something like the EU. That's where we're headed. Now, I know it sounds extreme, and I don't want it to be extreme. I want it to be sensible. I'm not saying 4 guys happened to decide to change the course of history and they did it all by themselves. No. Nor am I calling them superheroes. I've spent 30 years writing books about the founders in which my major goal is to turn them into flawed founders. Great, but flawed. Guess what? Just like us. If they weren't flawed, if they were gods, if they were perfect, if they were superheroes, what in heaven's name do we have to learn from? But the argument in the quartet is that these four people, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, and Jay was a discovery for me. Now, we'll talk about him in just a second. Collaborate to agree that the current government isn't functioning, it's dysfunctional. They instigate the movement for the calling of a constitutional convention. They court Washington to become a member of that. Without him, it will never work. Washington legitimizes what would otherwise not be perceived as legitimate. The reason it's not going to be legitimate is because the mandate from the Articles is to revise the Articles, and once they meet, they're not going to revise the Articles, they're going to replace the Articles. They then set the agenda in Philadelphia with the Virginia Plan. They can't control the agenda in the convention, and I'll tell you why in a second. They then attempt to orchestrate the ratification process by writing the Federalist Papers, and then Madison single-handedly writes the Bill of Rights. That's a lot, okay? There are lots of other actors in this story, but these are the leaders. I don't want them to be, I don't want to be accused of calling them divine in any sense of the term, but this is a moment. If I'm right, this is one of the most consequential moments of American leadership in all of American history. Consequential in terms of what comes out of it. Something happens that changes the political chemistry and makes the need for some kind of national government more conspicuously necessary. Story. It's August 3rd, 1782. It's Paris. John Jay is the American representative in the talks to negotiate an end to the war. The other negotiators, Franklin, he's got the gout. Adams is up in Amsterdam trying to negotiate a bank deal with the notoriously tight-fisted Dutch bankers. The guy who's supposed to replace Jefferson, who can't come, is Henry Lawrence, and he's captured at sea and is thrown in the Tower. So Jay has to sort of do it all himself, and he meets with this Count Orlando, like Orlando, Florida, because the French have a treaty with Spain, and the Americans have been told by the Congress that they cannot negotiate anything with the British without the French supporting it. The French have saved our bacon. They've given us money. They've given us troops. We couldn't have won the war without them. Therefore, we can't simply act independently. There's a map on the table. Orlando puts his finger on the Great Lakes somewhere around Erie, Pennsylvania, draws it down through Toledo, Ohio, and ends up in what is now Tallahassee, Florida. He says, everything east of that line is yours. Everything west of that line is ours, Spain's. Jay doesn't have to draw a line. He puts his finger on the Mississippi River. He says, everything east of that is ours. And that turns out to be the case. That is, the negotiated treaty, the great principal one is independence. The great prize one is the transmontane West, a third of a continent. Think about it. When the arguments are being made against British authority, when we're getting the run-up to the American Revolution, who is saying this is a war about empire? Nobody. But it becomes one. It essentially becomes, and Washington understands this, a continuation of the French and Indian War. The French and Indian War is a fight between Britain, France, Native Americans, and Americans for control of this area that is the eastern third of the North American continent. France gets knocked out. Now, Britain gets knocked out. It's going to be between us and the Native Americans, and we know what's going to happen there. Okay. I want to try to talk briefly about the way in which, as a historian, you can attempt to not, well, I'll put it the other way. When you're trained as a historian, you're trained to be enormously committed to the research process and to assemble enormous amounts of evidence. And you can imagine, if you're trying to write about something as famous as the Constitution or the ratification process, how much material, primary and secondary, there is. Though the documents that were mentioned at the start, the founding era documents, are the single most important primary source. My old mentor at Yale, God rest his soul, Ed Morgan, took me aside when I was starting my dissertation, and he said, when you construct a building, you put up scaffolding. When you take the building down, you remove the scaffolding. Many books of history are all scaffolding and no building. We don't do that. That was like the voice of God to me. And therefore, I had to try to find a way to tell this story about both the convention and the ratification process in a way that was true to the facts but didn't allow the story itself to be lost in the underbrush. And I had to try to figure out ways in which, what patterns existed. I'll take the ratification process first because it's more simple to tell you, even though it's complicated. Between November of 1787 and June, July of 88, 12 states have ratifying conventions, 1,648 delegates meet, and eventually the Constitution is ratified. If you read the best book on it by Pauline Maier, and she's the only person with the stamina and the patience to go through every state and recover it, the thing that's interesting is there's no pattern. Every state is different. And every state then is different from inside itself. Local groups, Maine, the people in Massachusetts are worried about whether Maine will be a state. The people in Georgia are worried about Indian attacks. The Tidewater planners are worried if we go into the federal government, we're going to have to pay our British and Scottish debtors, and they owe them about £4 million. Everything is different. That's the pattern. That's the important pattern. They cannot have a national conversation. America is incapable of having a national conversation. Their allegiances, their frameworks remain embedded in local and state-based borders. The only national conversation is the Federalist Papers. There's no such thing as the Anti-Federalist Papers because every state's different. That's the pattern. The pattern in the convention, there are three groups. People that want radical change, real nationalists. People who want to just revise the articles, moderates. And people who don't want any change at all. The latter group boycott the convention, with the exception of New York. Patrick Henry says, "I'm not going, I smell a rat." That means it's going to be a fight between the radicals and the moderates, those that want to significantly, not just revise, but replace the articles, and those who wish to merely revise them. The first group gets the advantage at the beginning because of Madison, and he writes the Virginia Plan, which becomes the agenda for the convention. They seize the initiative. But they can't win outright because the vote, in a parliamentary decision, nobody objected to it. The first day of the convention, they say, how are we going to vote? One state, one vote. That means Rhode Island has the same vote as Virginia. And that means the small states can block anything they want to. And they're going to block the radical agenda if at all possible. What that means is we're set up for a series of compromises that And the big compromise is going to be reached on July 17th when they agree to have a two-house legislature, the Senate by state, the House by population. There are two ghosts at the banquet during the entire summer of '87. One they keep talking about incessantly is monarchy. Any robust expression of executive authority is going to be called monarchy. And therefore, if you read the section of the Constitution on the executive power, you try to figure out what the president can do. It's impossible. You can tell how he's supposed to be elected, this crazy thing they come up with called the Electoral College, and they can tell how they're going to impeach him, but they don't want to talk about what he can do because it's too threatening. The thing they can't mention is slavery. And the word never appears, nor does the word African American or black in the document. The preferred term is that species of property. Here's what hard truth. Modern day abolitionists and the abolitionists of the 19th century call the Constitution a covenant with death because it doesn't end slavery and it implicitly endorses slavery. 3/5 clause. Also, there's a what do you call it, a compromise reached that the slave trade will not be ended immediately, it will be extended for 20 years in return for the fact that the vote on tariff issues, economic issues of tariff, will not necessarily require a supermajority. The South gets something but has to give something up. Later on, Calhoun says that was a bad deal for us. Anyway, here's the hard truth. If they had inserted any article putting slavery on the road to extinction, the Constitution would have never passed. And if by some miracle it passed, it would have never been ratified. So you can hold on to your moral principles now, but they're facing a political choice. The other tragedy is many of them, including Madison, thought that slavery was going to die a natural death, that slave labor would not compete successfully with free labor. And they didn't see the cotton gin coming. They didn't see the cotton kingdom. But they made a compromise with the devil because they couldn't do anything else. And then you can play it out. Well, suppose they hadn't done that. Suppose they had insisted and then there wasn't a constitution. That means we're back to the Articles. What happens then? Probably division into a series of confederacies. A New England Confederacy, a Middle Confederacy, a Southern Confederacy, like Europe, Scandinavia, Middle Atlantic, and Italy. And then that's bad because the Southern Confederacy is going to sign a separate treaty with Britain because they're going to produce cotton for the British industry, and slavery is going to last even longer than it did. So no scenario here is a good scenario. The principles and what I've been trying to do here is distinguish the forest for the trees and say these are the patterns that operated both in the ratification process and then in the convention itself. And these guys, and I mean, you got to read the book to catch the, all the detail on this. But they're implicated throughout. There's a poignant letter. Let me tell you, Washington really didn't want to join this gang. He wanted to stay in Mount Vernon. And part of it was he had said he was retiring forever. And Cincinnatus, he became Cincinnatus, the soldier that retires. Cincinnatus cannot come back. And there's a letter to Lafayette, 1784, last time he sees Lafayette, and after he's just left, he says, this is probably the last time we'll have seen each other. He says, I feel myself sliding down the stream of life, climbing for 52 years. I'm of good constitution, but of poor, he means genes. Like nobody in the Washington line for 5 generations ever lasted past their 50s. They all die earlier. And he says, I will soon be entering the dark mansion of my ancestors, but I shall not regret. I have had my day. He doesn't want to go back. He wants to die at Mount Vernon, and he doesn't think he's going to live very long. But they get him. He's the great prize. He makes it legitimate. He doesn't say a single thing at the convention until the last day when he says, by the way, instead of 40,000, make it 30,000 in terms of the size of a congressional district. Immediately, they say, oh, that's not like radio. Everybody in the quartet is disappointed at the end of the convention. They think they failed. Madison wanted to get a provision that would allow the executive branch of the federal government to veto all state legislation, a clear statement of sovereignty at the federal level. He also wanted popular representation in both houses of Congress. Lost both. Lost both. There is a moment, and I might end with this because I got all this great stuff to tell you about original intent. So somebody asked me a question about the Second Amendment when we get to, and I'll tell you. But here's Madison as he enters the ratification process and how he thinks about. Actually, this gets to the issue. It mentions it at least a little bit. Let me see if I can get it here. Okay. His thought process, or perhaps his way of thinking about the ratification process, was beginning to change as he read the newspaper essays and editorials from multiple states. It gradually dawned on him that if he had gotten what he wanted at the Philadelphia Convention, the prospects for the ratification of the Constitution would have been remote in the extreme. In a long and quite extraordinary letter to Jefferson, the fullest and clearest exposition of what the Constitutional Convention had achieved that Madison ever wrote, he described the hybrid creature that the Constitution had created as part confederation, part nation. The delegates had willy-nilly, he said, managed to draw a line of demarcation which would give to the general government every power requisite for general purposes and to leave to the states every power which might be most beneficial to them. This sounds great. Left unsaid was that no one knew where that line existed or what general purposes meant. Although it would take Madison several months to develop the full implications of this evolving idea, its outlines were already pretty clear in this letter to Jefferson. The key insight might be called the beauty of ambiguity. Madison had misguidedly, he now realized, pushed for an unambiguous resolution of the sovereignty question during the convention. Now it was becoming clear to him that the great achievement of the convention and of the Constitution as well was to embrace the inconvenient truth that there was no consensus on the sovereignty question either in the convention or in the country itself. So what they had created, albeit out of necessity rather than choice, was a political framework that deliberately blurred the sovereignty question and essentially said, well, if you think sovereignty's there, that's okay. If you think sovereignty's there, that's okay. Most of them, by the way, at the time, thought that each branch of the government should decide the meaning of the Constitution for itself. They didn't think, the one thing they didn't want the Supreme Court to be was supreme. In the long run, and this was probably Madison's most creative insight, the multiple ambiguities embedded in the Constitution made it an inherently living document. For it was designed not to offer clear answers to the sovereignty question, or for that matter, to the scope of executive or judicial authority, but instead to provide a political arena in which arguments about those contested issues could continue in a deliberative fashion. The Constitution was intended less to resolve arguments than to make argument itself the solution. For judicial devotees of originalism or original intent, this should be a disarming insight. I hope Scalia is out there in the audience. Since it made the Constitution the foundation for an ever-shifting political dialogue that, like history itself, was an argument about end. Madison's original intention was to make all original intentions infinitely negotiable in the future. I'm going to end there, and thank you for listening. We have microphones on both sides, and since these are going to be recorded for posterity, you have to go to the microphone to have your question. I'll repeat it anyway. Yes?
Professor Ellis, while people are going to the microphones, I'll go ahead and bring it up. How about that Second Amendment?
All right. The Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary for the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. If you want to really take original intent seriously, okay, the question is, what was Madison's intentions when he wrote those words, right? Now, you can read Scalia's decision in D.C. versus Heller, 2008. Guess what? It's 33 pages single-spaced. It never mentions James Madison. Doesn't mention him. He wrote it, right? He defended it in the House and the Senate. How did he write it? This is how it happened. Madison didn't really believe in the Bill of Rights. He didn't think the Constitution needed a Bill of Rights. He had been saying throughout the ratification process, well, if you write a Bill of Rights and you try to list all the rights, then you might leave some out, and that will be worse. Jefferson wanted a Bill of Rights. Jefferson didn't care about the Constitution. He just wanted a Bill of Rights. Madison decided to do a Bill of Rights, and initially his first thought, totally misguided, was to corkscrew the rights he would write into the existent document. Then somebody said, but you can't do that because everybody's already signed this document and now you're revising it and that's not going to work. So he says, okay, I guess we have to put it at the end. So it becomes a codicil at the end. He says, my real reason here isn't to envision the ultimate, this is not American Magna Carta by his mind, okay? We don't need it. You need Magna Carta because you got kings and you need protection. In a republic, you don't need this. But I'll put it in because it will influence people in the states who reluctantly came along when ratification. And in the process, 6 states made recommendations for amendments. They totaled over 200 recommended amendments. If you synthesize them and bring it down, knock out the repetitions, they made 132 recommended amendments. Madison took the 200 or 132 amendments and said, now, out of this, how can I construct a Bill of Rights? That's how he went about it. How many of the 132 had anything to do with the right to bear arms? How many had to do with the fear of a standing army? 6. That's what he's responding to. He's responding to the fear the states have of a standing army and thereby insisting that there be a militia that is responsible for national defense rather than any kind of professional army. That's what the thinking is that went into the Second Amendment, okay? D.C. versus Heller is one of the worst decisions in American constitutional history. There are 3 bad decisions in American constitutional history, and 2 of them, well, no. 3 really bad ones. The worst one in American history is Dred Scott, right? 1857. That's the worst. The second worst is Citizens United. And the third worst is D.C. versus Heller, because it allows people in the National Rifle Association, who already believe this, to believe they really have a constitutional right to bring a gun into a bar and whatever they want to do. But the thing about what I'm saying here is, and I'll shut up, if you actually do what Scalia says you're supposed to do and figure out what the intent of the framers is, it comes out exactly opposite from what he intended. Okay? All right. Thank you. Obviously, I feel strongly about this. Over there, and then we'll get you, sir. Yes, sir.
Yes. In talking about Lincoln and giving the Gettysburg Address,
Yeah.
He was incorrect about the date. Is one thing you're saying historically is that he was correct with the distance of time, that it was a new nation and they didn't realize it then? Is that something you're saying?
that's a it's a mystic question, mystic chords of memory kind of question. But what I would say is America is not a nation. It begins to be a nation after the War of 1812. It doesn't become a full nation until after the Civil War.
And that was
It is the Civil War that destroys the states' rights argument completely. It's no constitutional argument that's going to end it. And that we are not fully a nation until 1865.
right, and that wasn't just dead white men. That was a war over who was human, and that was a right over African Americans being fully human. Correct.
Say again. I think I agree with.
In other words, the idea is, you say you're a historian of dead white men in the Constitution, but it wasn't fully realized what it meant to be an independent country until we had a war, and the war, at least one of the causes, was over who was a human, and those included not white men.
Well, yeah. I mean, but did Jefferson, in the language he used, intend to make blacks human? Yeah, he did, but he didn't intend to make them equal.
But
Jefferson believed they're biologically unequal.
did the men fighting on the Union side at Gettysburg intend to make them equal?
Some of them did, and some of them didn't. When they go back home, they segregate all the societies in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, right?
Right.
So that, and I'm a Southerner, so I like to talk about that, And racism, I think, it's still with us. The notion that, my God, it's not like poison ivy, it's cancer, and we're never going to kill it all. Lincoln made a step forward. Martin Luther King made another step forward. Jefferson actually made the first step. They ought to talk to each other on the mall. They got a lot to say to each other.
Right.
And, but we still, then there's got to be somebody else after Martin Luther King to take it the next step. But it is in those words you're talking about. And in that sense, see, Lincoln thought that the great document wasn't the Constitution. All the lawyers in the world think the great document is the Constitution. Lincoln thought that was just a framework for government. The moral foundation for the Republic is laid in the Declaration
of Independence.
as he saw it.
Thank you.
I hope you're okay. You're okay with what I'm just saying?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you. I've read a whole bunch of your books, and I really enjoy them.
I got one kid left in college forever.
Yeah, okay. I really enjoy them.
He's going to graduate, though.
I have a whole bunch of things. Let me just throw out a couple of things. You mentioned between 1755 and 1765.
65 and 75.
75, yeah.
Yeah.
Was there any realistic chance that the Americans could have been made English citizens? Was that a realistic option even? And would that have prevented the revolution?
Okay, that's a good question. Was the American Revolution avoidable? Yeah, but Britain, in fact, the fact that it happened is the biggest blunder in the history of British statecraft. It wasn't anything we had to do. All they had to do was say, okay, you guys can make laws for your own, and your own legislatures can make laws. They needed to discover the British Commonwealth 100 years before they discovered it. Mm-hmm. Burke was arguing this. Pitt was arguing this in the House of Commons and the House of Lords. And George III and his minions said, no, we got the power to squash this thing. There's no reason to compromise. They can't possibly win the war. If you actually look at the war as a counterinsurgency operation, no counterinsurgency operation has ever succeeded. We say, how could we win the war? They had no way of winning. We didn't win the war. We just didn't lose. And as long as we don't lose, we win. And they go away, right? I mean, somebody should have told us to betray us. And they used to ask me, what would Washington have done about Iraq? I said he wouldn't even know where it was. And but he would say, what the hell are we doing being the British? Why are we the British? Doesn't make sense to him. I'm going on. You got one more. Go, fire.
Okay, thank you. You mentioned John Jay.
Yeah, he is going to go up in stature. Not just because I say so, but because his papers are coming out now. They've been delayed because they were hoarded by a professor at, well, let's not mention professor. They were hoarded at Columbia University for 20 or 30 years, and now as they come out, this guy's letters, his letters to his wife, I read a book about Abigail and John called First Family. I like it, and his letters to his wife, Sarah, are almost as good as the Abigail and John letters. And that's the highest possible standard, okay? And his serenity is amazing. You know, like, after he says that's the Mississippi, he goes to the quarters of Franklin, he takes his pipe and throws it in the fireplace, and he says, "Thus we break our alliance with France." He knew we couldn't stay allied with France because that was going to end up allowing Spain to claim all this land. And see, again, they don't have cell phones, so he can't check in with anybody and say, "I'm going to do this," you know? He just does it. And he gives us this incredible area as a result. Did I interrupt you?
No, I was going to ask. Well, you answered the question, but that begs the next question. Will there be a J Street in Washington, D.C.?
Well, there's already a criminal justice college for him in New York because he was the first Chief Justice. And I don't know. But you just make, you know, like these people, it's like presidential sweepstakes thing. They go up and down. But Jefferson's on the way down, by the way. Now, nobody's going to tear down the Jefferson Memorial, but Adams is up, Jefferson's down, Washington is there forever, and but Jay's coming on. Yes, sir.
The name of your book is Quartet. Quartet, when I
Pretty
think
catchy,
of it,
huh? Yeah.
when I think of it in a classical music sense, I see four people working very tightly together. They meet all the time. They have like same script music.
Some of that's true.
When I think of a jazz quartet, I think
improvisation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is that how you're seeing them, as jazz or as classical?
Nobody has ever asked me this question. I think they practice once or twice, and then they say everybody's on their own after that. And so there is to give you an example. How did the Federalist Papers get written? Okay? 3 of them write the Federalist Papers, right? There's 85 Federalist Papers. Madison writes 29. Hamilton writes 51. That guy's unbelievable. He deserves a play written about him, you know? But it's described as the great deliberation in American history on Republican government, right? Assigned in all the political... There's absolutely no time for deliberation whatsoever. Like, Hamilton is writing it on the top of a barrel on a schooner from Albany to New York. His wife says, that's what he's doing. Madison says I was writing as the printer put the keys in. So it's an all-nighter. It's not and the fact that it's cogent is a miracle. It comes together pretty, so you can't, it's taken until the 1950s for us to figure out who wrote which one. Now we know, but it's pretty tough to know. But I like your question.
Electoral College.
Yeah.
It and the juries are the only 2 places in the Constitution where they thought this decision is so important to the general people need to make the decision. And you don't see, isn't Electoral College brilliant? I've only been to 8 of them in 8 states.
I would have preferred a parliamentary government. And the first proposal in the Virginia plan would have been a parliamentary government. The president was elected by the national legislature. They talked about the executive branch more than any other subject. They kept going at it and going away, coming back, going away, because they didn't agree and they were scared of any robust expression of authority. The Electoral College is the implementation of the compromise reached about the Congress onto the presidency. Meaning, southern states are going to have extra electoral votes here because they're going to count slaves as 3/5. Jefferson would have never been elected president if it weren't for that. The Electoral College gives the South a huge advantage, or not a huge advantage, but gives it an advantage. It also, I mean, in modern day parlance, I mean, like, why is it like, you know, we're going to turn on TV and there's only going to be like 5 states that are going to be given enormous attention because the rest are already decided. And I think that's misguided. I wish we could go to a popular vote. That was a proposal. You know why they didn't adopt it? Because there was no way to record it. I mean, how do you have an election amongst 5 million people in which they're separated and you can't count them?
Well,
Now we can count them, so let's go back and let's do popular vote.
well, similarly, mathematically, your arguments would be for the NBA Finals of the World Series being decided by the number of runs or points, not 7 games.
Listen, I'm a real expert on the NBA, so you're not going to get me on this, okay? This is a false analogy. And
It's a great analogy.
by the way, let me talk about Deflategate here. I really am. I'm from Massachusetts. This is a real crock of crap here that's going on.
I thought you were from the South.
I am, but I lived in I've only been in Massachusetts for 42 years, so I've become a Patriots fan. But I'm from Virginia originally. Went to Gonzaga in D.C. Yeah. Sir.
I've got so many questions, I don't know where to start. But in answer to what the gentleman said, I mean, not everybody could vote then.
Women couldn't vote. People without property couldn't vote. Although the property qualification in the United States didn't knock out that many people because most people owned land, most white males. The property qualification in Britain limited the electorate to about 15%. Here, it eliminated in New England, for example, it was like 60%.
My question to you is like, we've all grown up in a system where the Supreme Court comes to a decision which becomes not an opinion, but a decision. And initially, the Supreme Court was a body that was used by the House of Representatives to form law, because these were experts in the law. And could you say a little bit?
I'm not sure about that. No. I mean, I think what I'd say is that if you are honest historically, there is a need to believe that somewhere in the government there is this one place where wisdom overcomes all form of partisanship. And so there is a need to sanctify the judiciary. That's one of the reasons they didn't want to be televised. You can see how stupid some of those guys are. And, really. The truth is, the Supreme Court, from the time it existed, has always been a political body. It's always been shaped by the partisan values of the people on it. And if it's like John Marshall, I happen to agree with the partisanship. If it's like Scalia, I think, or Roberts, then I'm on the other camp. But the illusion is, you know, like the Roberts thing, you know, like I just call balls and strikes. I don't decide on the strike zone. Bullshit, you know? Give me a break, you know? I stopped believing in that when I stopped believing in the Easter Bunny, okay? And, excuse me, sir, have I upset you? Oh, okay, all right. All right, last one. Here, we got to go.
All right. First of all, did you fail all those kids at Putney?
No, I gave all A's.
All right.
I mean, well, you didn't pass them. You picked the winner.
Yeah.
You know, like
okay.
Yeah.
So, as the ratification process goes on, you know, the states obviously ratify. What happens to places like North Carolina, Rhode Island that don't sign on before the inauguration? Are they in this weird limbo state, or?
Yeah. Like one of the things you're saying that I didn't stress enough is, in the Constitution, it says, if 9 states ratify, it's law. That's illegal. According to the articles, unanimity was necessary for any amendment, much less for a whole new government. They picked 9. And the whole game in ratification is get to 9. Once we get to 9, everybody else will have to come along. We'll never win New York. We'll never win North Carolina. We might lose Virginia. But if we get to 9 before those late states, we're going to win. And enforcing that is one of the roles that Madison plays as an orchestrator. I don't know how he does it because, he doesn't, again, have technology, but he's a nose counter, man. This guy knows exactly how many votes there are in Maryland and how many votes there are in New Hampshire and who's voting which way and who has to be. It's amazing what he can do. And that's a form of political behavior that most Virginia gentlemen regard as unseemly. It comes to Madison naturally. He loves it. That's what he really is. He thinks like a politician. He doesn't think like a philosopher. He thinks like a lawyer. So, I'm here to defend a sovereign government, and therefore I'm going to make every argument I can and subordinate or cover up all the other arguments. That's the way his mind works. But the 9 votes. How did I get to this? What was the question you asked? There was the ratification process in South Carolina and New York. New York was 2-1 against it. And what Hamilton did, the biggest contribution Hamilton made in New York, he's part of the debate. Jay and Hamilton are part of the debate. And their game is to delay. He's got horses set up in Poughkeepsie to go down to Philadelphia and down to Williamsburg to find out results, okay? That's the most important thing he did. And so, Virginia ratified. Okay, we can shut up now because that's it. And it turns out New Hampshire, they didn't even know this, had already ratified. That was the 9th. Virginia was the 10th. And once that happens, in New York, the Clinton people say, we're going to fight this. Later on, Henry says, we're going to fight it too. And they start a second convention movement. This is one of the reasons that Madison writes the Bill of Rights, to kill this, okay? The second convention is going to kill the Constitution, and he knows that. And so, but Rhode Island, like Washington says, I'm going to visit all the states while I'm president. Like Obama has just done. He only has 13 to go. Later, it's going to be more than that because of Vermont. But he bypasses Rhode Island because Rhode Island hasn't ratified, and then he has to make a separate trip to go to Rhode Island. They suffer nothing. In other words, there's no political prejudice against them. I think there's a little bit of political prejudice against New York, but it's less because of their tardiness on this issue than because they really got a lot of Tories there. And they were under British control throughout the war. New York takes a lot of shit. Excuse me, yes. I want to thank you for coming. I hope that I've interested you in a way of understanding how we moved from the Declaration to the Constitution. It's actually an interesting story. It is a top-down story and not a bottom-up story. And I know that the profession and any democratic culture tends to privilege bottom-up. And the revolution as a story can be told bottom-up. There's truth to that. This one, no. This was not a popular movement. It came about, and unless you're prepared to make the case that we'd have been better off without a constitution, which seems to me to be a pretty hard case to make, it was a benevolent coup d'etat. Thank you very much. I think I'm going to go and sign books back there.
Isn't it something? That's cool.
This is so fascinating. It's mind-boggling.
It is.